Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations number 35. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, the battered grappler from New Jersey. Was on vacation last week, so no episode from me. But I hope you had time to listen to my conversation with Erica Zendel. She's one of my favorite people in this weird space of grapplers who also write and who also take their training very seriously. And she's just kind of a kindred spirit, and I hope you got something out of our talk about how jiu-jitsu can be used thematically to change your life, in her case, to overcome some past trauma, to heal from a broken heart, to really get clear on what's important to her from a values perspective. Hopefully there's something in there that you can relate to and that you can put into action. If you haven't listened to that conversation, I suggest that you go back and give it a listen. We're going to be doing future in-depth conversations periodically with people like that to kind of break up the format a little bit so I can get out of these monologue type situations. Although I think my Sam Harris impression is getting a little bit better the more of these that I do. But this week will be more along the lines of our conventional format. And just a lot of stuff came up on vacation in the negative space that one has on vacation. Although I will say that vacationing with a 2-year-old who is rambunctious and mobile is a lot different from vacationing as a childless adult. You're basically just providing childcare in another location where you don't have all the stuff and all the resources that you're accustomed to. So not as much relaxation as previous vacations, but certainly just as much, if not more, joy just watching my son experience these things for the first time. He was at the beach last year, but he was barely a year old, so I'm sure that he didn't really remember any of that, and he was kind of too afraid to go in the ocean. But now he's just so curious about his surroundings and engaged with the world, and it's just beautiful to see him experience some of these things for the first time. He was just fascinated by this seagull that was pulling apart a crab and eating it. Yeah, he's clearly got a dark mind like me, but he wanted to watch that for as long as it continued. Other than that, coming back from vacation, just really into the heart of my training camp for Masters Worlds. You can probably see that I have a pretty nice black eye on my right eye. My lip is also busted up. My left wrist is not doing so well from making and breaking grips, to the point where last night I actually took a tennis ball and taped it into my palm so I couldn't make grips, which was a good adaptation. And I was surprised what I could accomplish with one hand. I mean, Jean-Jacques Machado certainly did a good job with it. So certainly not a limiting factor in any capacity. And I think the net positive there was that I didn't make this chronic inflammatory situation in my wrist any worse. It was one of those things where, it resolved over vacation and then like 2 days back on the mat, flared back up again. So, hey, any of my opponents at Masters Worlds, if you're listening to this, you know that my left wrist is jacked up. Just giving it away. But what are you going to do? I think that was one of the things that I really admired about Marcelo Garcia when he was kind of in more of a competitive mode, was that he put it all out there. With MG in action, you could see exactly what he was working on at any given time. And it really sent the message that to his opponents that you're going to be playing my game. I don't really care. You know exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it to such a high level that it doesn't matter if you know what I'm going to do. It's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. I'm not Marcelo by any stretch, but I certainly could use a bit of that confidence and certainty. And we talked a little bit about that in the conversation with Erica. I was just so blown away by the rootedness she has in her training. And I actually backtracked a little bit and I said, I think what you're describing is not confidence. That's not fair, because I think confidence can be cheap. Like I think of like a confidence man, a person who is a con artist and plies their criminal trade based on the fact that they can inspire confidence in other people. But there's a big difference between that and conviction roots into something much deeper. And I think Erica has conviction in spades. So hopefully I can channel a little bit more of that as I go into this camp. Definitely picking the hardest people in the room consistently and pushing myself to the edge to the point where this week I was feeling extremely depleted. Didn't help that on Monday I got invited to this person I know's private wave pool. And what an experience that was. You get the equivalent in 2 hours in a wave pool. You can get the equivalent of like 200 hours of surfing on the ocean, just because you can set the wave exactly as you want it, and you can get the wave as consistently as you want it to be and practice specific aspects of your surfing game. Whereas, when you're on the ocean, you never have the same wave twice. So you can get very specific and very directed with your training in a way that you can't when you're out on the water. But because you get a lot more reps, you also get a lot more tired. So, man, this past week, like my shoulders and my neck have just been screaming from paddling so much, paddling way more than I would have paddled in a traditional surfing session. And going into the week with that, having come off of a week of vacation, putting the pedal right back down in my training camp, it got me thinking a lot about this idea of what is enough in terms of quantity and quality of our training. And this is something I wrestle with a lot, especially as I get older, because just from a pure quantitative perspective, what I can do quantitatively is not what I could do as recently as like 4 or 5 years ago. To boot, I've never really been somebody who recovers particularly well. I'm slow to recover. I need my rest, perhaps more so than other people. And I need more rest as I age in order to be able to do what I do. And the other thing is that, like so many of you listening to this podcast, I'm not a professional grappler. Like, I have a career and a life outside of jiu-jitsu. Although like the older I get and the more I work, the more those two things seem to converge. But I'm not out there trying to win world championships to land more seminars or sell more instructionals or things like that. I earn a living doing other things. So the amount of damage I'm willing to sustain is kind of less so than other grapplers per se. Like, I look at the Meow Brothers, for example, and if you just watch the way they walk, they walk like men who are twice their age, and that's just not something I want. I want this body to give me quality years, hopefully for a long time. So I really wrestle with this idea of what is enough, and that's the subject matter of this week's meditation number 35. It's called What is Enough? Enough is illusory. Enough implies that there's a static location, place, or quantity that suffices. It implies that life itself is static, that we can put into mount or side control and do with it what we will. But life is liquid, flowing, shapeless, formless. It is everywhere and nowhere all at once. How do we hold on to it? How do we prepare to meet all of the contingencies? What is enough preparation to meet it on the right terms? There is no enough. There is only right practice, and right practice is practice without end. Ends, too, are illusory. Yeah, so right now I'm listening to, I don't remember the name of the podcast, but it's essentially a collection of some of Alan Watts' lectures put together by his son and the Ram Dass Network. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes so you can check it out if you want, but I'm sure if you just go to Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts and search Alan Watts, you'll be able to find it. And one of the things that Watts talks about in the first lecture that I have mixed feelings about is this idea of dropping out of karma. He says that the quick-minded person realizes the hack, and this is a direct quote, the hack that is karma. In other words, they realize that if they can live and act with pure presence in this premeditative space where you're just acting before thought, then you can kind of jettison all the karma you've accumulated from your past lives. It's instantaneous. And that's sort of like instant enlightenment. And I'm doing a poor job in explaining this, folks. I'm not a Buddhist or an Eastern scholar by any stretch, although aspects of it appeal to me. But he says, and I really take and he quick-witted, by the way, direct quote, and I really take umbrage with this second part. He says that for the slow-witted, gradual enlightenment is the way to go. They need sort of that grind. They need to feel like they're striving. And I take issue with that because I think that there's sort of an exquisiteness to the slow path. There's like picture yourself on a long hike. Let's say you're on the Pacific coast and you're on a long hike down this cliffside riddled with switchbacks. And at the bottom of the cliff, is the Pacific Ocean in all of its blue wonder. And it's going to be a beautiful rocky beach, perhaps about 200 yards wide. And it's going to be the stuff that Instagram models just dream of. And then you can run down those switchbacks. It's downhill, so you're not going to strain yourself particularly hard to get to that payoff that is the view. Or you can really take your time and savor every step of the journey. You can notice the thick lichen and moss that's coating the trees. You can perhaps notice some really bizarre mushrooms that are sprouting out among like this essentially like western rainforest terrain, or the pattern that the shadows on the ferns make as the sun coats the cliffside. You can notice all these things and you can appreciate them and you can make memories based on them. You can realize the smallness of your one human life just surrounded in this space that's teeming with life. And all of these things, all these realizations, all these moments, I believe, have value. And yeah, you might get to your destination a bit slower, but all of those experiences are essentially bits of training that you're accumulating, that are giving you context, that are giving you wisdom. And to just hack it, like for example, you could just run down the hillside, blow through the switchbacks, and take the straightest crows, as the crow flies, line down to the beachhead. You could do that. You'd probably be okay. You might face plant, break your nose, but maybe not. And you'd get there faster and you'd get to appreciate the Instagram model view a bit faster. But what will you have given up by not striving? So I think that there's certainly value in this process of striving, of being in this training camp, of putting everything I have into it. And honestly, I've always been of the mindset that the training camp is more educational and more important than the actual competition. And maybe that's why I've never had a ton of success in competition, right? But practice for me has been regardless of what I'm playing, like it was football, jiu-jitsu, cross country, track, practice was where the exquisiteness was. I could think about these things on a microscopic level, whether it was like the placement of my toes on the starting line for the 800-meter dash, or the first step I would take coming off the offensive line, or the way I'm grabbing somebody's sleeve and punching it upward to kill their ability to regrip me. I take a lot of satisfaction and I gain a lot of wisdom and I think depth of experience by really going deep on the micro. And I wonder what would be lost if I simply tried to hack it and jump to the end. But yeah, there is this idea of enough. Like what is enough of all of that to achieve what I want to achieve, which in this case is a gold medal at Masters Worlds. And I think that the problem is that, as I say in the essay, enough implies that there's a point in time or a quantity or a place where everything reaches equilibrium. But of course, we know that's not true. Life is constantly undulating, just like a jiu-jitsu match is constantly undulating. It really can't be put into that box. It can't be stabilized. There really is no stable point. It's similar to what Robert Pirsig says about quality, that you know what quality is, but it can't be defined. And as soon as you define it, it's lost. Like, for example, I hand you two watches. Let's say one watch is a 50-cent watch that you got out of the gumball machine at your local ShopRite, and the other is a Rolex watch. I put those watches in your hands, and immediately, without me telling you anything about them, you know which one is of the higher quality. I don't have to give you any information. You can just feel it. You can sense it. So enough similarly operates in a way in which it exists on a moment-to-moment basis. It's known. It's a known entity. It's not something that you can prepare for. For example, enough in one fight might be a completely different thing than enough in another fight. And we all know that fights and that moments within fights are transitory. We can't train to a specific point or a specific technique and just rest on that laurel. Like, we have to be prepared for multitudes of contingencies in order to meet the moment and move with it. And that creates this dilemma of, I shouldn't say it's a dilemma, it creates this problem of, well, how do I prepare for that? There are various permutations of limitless permutations of contingencies that can come up in a match. How can I train to meet all of them? I don't even know what all of them are. It's not possible to know what all of them are. And I think this is where the power of thematic training comes into play. We have to train at literal and metaphorical agility, adaptability, and fluidity. And that takes having an ecology of practices around jiu-jitsu that aren't just jiu-jitsu specific. This is where I talk about things like mindfulness training. This is where I talk about things like mindfulness training. Like, for example, if we're looking to change at fluidity or adaptability, I might thematically train at like taking one of these guitars down and improvising on something. Or I might train at putting myself into social situations that I'm not familiar with, where I might be uncomfortable. These things don't particularly have anything to do with jiu-jitsu whatsoever. They might not have a direct measurable impact on the quality of your jiu-jitsu, but they're going to have a tangible impact on how you relate to the game and how you approach it. And I think that more importantly, like, these things are going to make you more adaptable and agile as a human. And really, that's what I'm here to be. That's what I'm here to be about as somebody hosting this podcast. I'm not, if you want technical instruction on jiu-jitsu, you could get it from much more qualified people. I'm really here thinking about this art as a way of life and how can I use it to make myself better across the board. This is just yet another example of that. It's all part of this ecosystem of training. And I like to think of it as something Josh Waitzkin says is, it's a life of training. And this is a point of tension that I was really wrestling with when I was on vacation, because to me, being on vacation, sitting on a beach, playing with my son, reading a book, these things are superficially, they're not training. But when the gas pedal is always down, sometimes the training that's required is learning to release the gas pedal. It's learning to accept that rest is just as important as training. It's a part of training. It's the lesson that stress and recovery are part of a dynamical system, that you can't just embrace one of these things wholesale and ignore the other. And when you kind of live and work with that mindset, everything is training. The way you hold your child is training. The way you interact with your spouse or your significant other is training. The way you carry on a conversation is training. The way you shake somebody's hand is training. Really, what this is all about is bringing presence to all these different interactions and being there for it in an adaptable, agile way, and not being lost in this churn of thought, the what ifs, the contingencies that I'm describing in these competitive scenarios. It's having that level of conviction that somebody like Erica has, knowing that you've done the work both on and off the mats, and that you can be present to whatever is unfolding. I think that's ultimately what we're striving for when we're talking about what a life of training is. And it really is truly a life of training. As I said at the end of this little essay here, it's a continuum. Ends to are illusory. This continues whether I'm awake, whether I'm sleeping, whether I'm doing jiu-jitsu, whether I'm not doing jiu-jitsu. All of this is part of that cycle, and it really doesn't end. And it doesn't end in the sense that when I'm gone, the organism that was Joe will not be doing jiu-jitsu, but the jiu-jitsu will continue. That's really all I've got for you this week. Let's see, where are we at on time? Yeah, I've said plenty. We're at the 20-minute mark. I try and cap these things at 20 minutes. But that's all I've got for you. And I have another podcast later today. I should mention the other podcast I'm recording today is with Emily Kwok and Bayer from Show You Roll. It's called Highest Levels, and it's a sub-podcast to BJJ Mental Models. You can get a free trial of BJJ Mental Models, I think, for a week and you could listen to that podcast, or you can sign up. Just go over to the BJJ Mental Models website. Emily and I will be riffing with people we find interesting. We'll be talking about things relative to our peak performance work with Josh Waitskin. We might be talking about random shit too. Like, I'm sure at some point we're going to talk a bit more about our wave pool experience. But yeah, definitely check that out. Very kind of Steve to set that up and get me on that podcast. I'll also be doing a solo cast with Steve at some point. I guess it wouldn't be a solo cast. It'll just be me and Steve, traditional BJJ Mental Models Ed episode at some point, where I think I'm going to talk about finding your why in jiu-jitsu and get really tactical about what that is and why it's significant, and kind of scale that up into what I talked about a little bit in this episode, having a life of training and what the benefits of something like that are. So stay tuned for details on that. In the meantime, if you want to support BJJ Meditations, you can do so on Mirror. You can buy an NFT of this episode or not. Don't really care. This is free information for you guys. If you want to support this podcast in some other way, you could like, subscribe, review, and share wherever you're listening to it. Interestingly, I was looking at the stats on YouTube, and apparently my YouTube audience is 100% male. 100% male, and you're all between the ages of like 24 and 34, which I find is remarkable. And I don't know what the stats are for the audio podcast, but all I have to do is look at Instagram to see that the majority of people who follow there are female. So, I don't know. I had no idea that these things were so split along gender lines. It's crazy. Yeah. But wherever you're listening to, if you could give us a like, subscribe, review, share with somebody else who would benefit from grappling or is a grappler, that'd be hugely beneficial. Of course, you can follow on Instagram. It's BJJ_meditations. The biggest thing you can do is if you're picking up what I'm laying down here, is you can work with me. I could certainly give you technical instruction in jiu-jitsu, but really what I'm more interested in doing is connecting your training thematically to the rest of your life and helping you structure your training in such a way where it's making you effective in multiple domains, such as your personal life, your professional life, etc. Or using jiu-jitsu as kind of a lens through which we can evaluate these things, think more critically. So if that speaks to you, you can contact me. My email address is in the show notes. The other thing you could do is read me on Substack. It's johannon.substack.com. I'm going to be posting some more stuff there. I just posted an essay kind of about the end of summer here in the Northeast and the transition into fall, into all the turbulent emotions that brings up for me every year. And finally, you can come train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with me and Emily, Coach Shane, and all the other amazing coaches we have. We welcome people from all academies of all ranks. We'd love to meet you, especially if you listen to this podcast. Every time somebody tells me that they listen to this podcast, I'm like just blown away. I'm like, wow, it's amazing. People actually are getting some value out of this. All right. It's even cooler when it's a total stranger. So, if this is speaking to you, if you have some feedback for me, please reach out on Instagram, send me a message, and I'd love to hear from you, or send me an email, whatever you'd want to do. But yeah, thanks a lot for tuning in, and I will see you all next week. Take care.